The Snow Walker's Son by Catherine Fisher. First published 1994 by Red Fox. Chapter 13. Odin, they said, swore an oath on his ring. Who from now on will trust him? They left at mid-morning. Thorkil had food ready. They ate it quickly in a tense silence. Jessa watched Carrie until he glanced at her with his sharp look. Then she smiled. Doubtfully, he smiled back. When everything was ready, Thorkil flung water on the fire and hauled a heavy pack onto his back. He picked up an axe and shoved it into his belt. "Well, I brought little. I'm taking away less." He grinned at Jessa. "It will be interesting to see how the world has changed." Outside they wrapped themselves in cloaks and hoods and thick gloves. The wind was cold. It was coming from the north and brought flecks of snow. Overhead the two ravens flapped against the clouds. "They'll miss you," Jessa said. Carrie looked up.
"They're coming. They go where I go."
He turned and looked back at the hall, at the black walls trapped in their gleaming coats of ice.
"It's strange," he whispered. "I feel as if I'm stepping out of myself, like a snake out of its skin."
"Come on." Thorkil caught his arm. "If her men catch us here, that's just what we'll all be doing." Carrie pulled a dark, ragged scarf up around his face. Then Thorkil led them across the courtyard and under the broken archway, out into the snow. All that long afternoon they walked, one in the footsteps of the other, up the long slopes of the mountain. The wind whistled against them as if it would push them back. The snow underfoot was soft under the top layer of thin, crunchy ice. They crossed the glacier carefully, slithering on the flat snow swirls, watching for cracks and crevasses, moving swiftly on the scree and tumbled stones. Once over they climbed again, along the sheer side of the fell, heading south, floundering through the soft, wetter snow. By the time they reached the top, the sky was dark purple, with a few stars scattered across it, faint as dust. Far off in the north, a pale aurora flickered over the mountain peaks. Jessa was wet through and breathless. She paused, looking back at the long blue scar they had torn through the snow. Thorkil looked too. "It's a dry night," he muttered. "That will still be there tomorrow, maybe even the day after. They'll see it." She looked at him. "They'll be here tomorrow?" "Bound to be. They'll ride hard." He turned and trudged on after Carrie and Thorkil. "When Gudrun wants a thing done, Jessa, it's done." By about midnight they had come back down to the tree line. Thorkil let them sleep for a while in thick pinewood, where the trees clustered so closely there was no snow. They lay on a century's thick quilt of needles and leaf mould, richly scented and full of tiny scurrying beetles. Too tired to notice, Jessa slept. The ravens woke her, croaking in the trees above her, sending down showers of dry, powdery snow. She sat up. Thorkil and Carrie were out at the tree's edge, talking. She saw Thorkil mark something on the ground with a stick. Thorkil lay nearby, still asleep, his fur hood up over his face, one arm thrown out carelessly. She shivered. It was barely light and bitterly cold. Thorkil turned. "About time. Come and have something to eat." It was the same cooked meat and some black hard bread. She chewed it slowly, looking out over the still white country, wrapped in its fogs and mists, the forests marching over slope and hillside like a motionless and silent army. Carrie stared out too, as if his eyes feasted on this different place. She caught the same vivid excitement in him as when he had first seen Thorkil and herself, his fingers clenched in their gloves, his eyes paler than ever in the early light. Finally Thorkil stirred and flung a handful of rotten cones at Thorkil. "Get up, lad. This is no place to sleep late." He turned to Jessa. "Get your things. Time's wasting." It took them a while to wake Thorkil. He seemed deep in dreams, and hardly knew where he was for a moment or two. Brokile grinned down at him. "Perhaps the young lord could get off his bed now, and take his scented bath." Thorkil smiled back, but Jessa thought he was still quiet and tired. Once they had begun to walk, none of them spoke very much. It was easier to trudge in silence through the empty land and the wide, bitter sky. Suddenly, at about midday, Carrie stopped. Then slowly he looked back. Jessa looked too. Smoke was rising over the skyline. Far off, a great black column of it, the underside lit with a faint red glow. Silent, the four of them watched it. It could only be Thraseshal. They'd been quick, Jessa thought, quicker than she'd dreamed. Gudrun must have chosen them well, men who wouldn't fear the place and its hidden creature. Perhaps she'd even told them something of the truth. They'd have searched, then burnt, and even now they would be galloping down the fell side. She turned straight into Brokale. His face was grim. "Yes, you're right. Carrie, come on." He pushed them into the trees and along the hilltop. The snow was thinner here, and in the tangle of undergrowth their tracks would be harder to see. Jessa knew he was worried. He urged them on tirelessly all afternoon. Carrie walked swiftly, and she wasn't tired herself. Oddly enough, it was Thorkil who held them back. More than once she had to call the others to wait for him. When he caught up, his breath came in gasps, and he clutched his side. "Can we rest?" he said at last. "What's the matter with you?" Brokale snarled. "Are you ill?" I don't know." He seemed puzzled and in pain. I can't seem to get my breath. Perhaps it's the cold. Just a few minutes, Brokale." But Brokale shoved him on. "We haven't got that long. A spear in the back will be a harder pain to put up with." But after a while, Thorkil stopped again. He collapsed onto his knees, dragging in air. Jessa crouched beside him. "He's really in trouble. We'll have to wait." Brokale stormed and cursed. Then he turned and marched off through the trees. "Where's he gone?" Jessa asked.
"To look back."
Carrie knelt beside her. He took his thin hand from its glove and gripped Thorkil's shoulder.
"Look at me," he said.
Shuddering, Thorkil looked up. Their eyes met. They were still for a moment, a long silence, and then Thorkil began to breathe easily and freely. At the same time, Carrie shivered as if something had chilled him. He put his glove back on and pushed the lank hair from his eyes. "What was it?" Jessa said to him.
"Nothing."
His pale eyes searched through the trees.
"Nothing. He'll be all right."
With a floundering of branches, Brokale was coming back. "No sign of them yet," he snapped. "The forest ends ahead, then the land is open moor. We'll have to cross it before tonight." He looked at Thorkil. "Can you manage?" "Yes." Jessa helped him up. He straightened slowly. "It's easier now. I don't know what caused it." "Never mind. Just move." They pushed their way out through the trees, the wet, heavy snow sliding from the branches onto their shoulders. Beyond, the land was a dim slope, frozen into stiff hillocks and littered with boulders under the snow. It was treacherous, but they scrambled down. Far overhead the two birds circled and swooped down, cawing and carking over Carrie's head as he slipped and stumbled at Jessa's side. Below, Brokale was close to Thorkil, both of them sliding on the loose scree that lay invisible under the snow. Horses would find this hard to manage. That would help, surely. By the time they had crossed the great moor, the short day was darkening. They were tired. Their ankles ached with the bruising of the stones. Before them lay a small lake, frozen white, but at its edge the land made an overhang where rock outcropped. The bitter wind brought tears to their eyes. Jessa's ears ached, and her toes were in agony. Brokale pushed his way through the scrub and under the overhang, and they followed, squatting in a breathless row against the rock. In the shelter and the quiet they coughed and spat and caught breath. Jessa felt Brocale's warmth glow at her side. She tugged her boots off and rubbed her wet feet. After a while, a faint glow touched her face and fingers. "Well," Brocale said at last, "here is as good as anywhere." "You mean we'll stay?" Thorkil said doubtfully. "We can't outrun them. We must hide." He looked at Carrie. "Will the birds warn us?" The boy nodded, tugging pine needles from his silvery hair. "Then we sleep," Brocale said, "all of us, while we can." "It's too cold," Thorkil objected. "We'll freeze, or we will later." Brocale gave him an irritated glance. "I don't think you'll find that if you're as tired as you should be. You were the one who wanted to stop." "Yes." Thorkil looked uneasy. "Yes, I know." They ate some dried meat from Brocale's pack, but it was hard to swallow, and there was nothing to drink but snow. Then they lay down, huddled together for warmth. Jessa felt Brocale pull his coat around Carrie. Then she slept, suddenly and completely. When she woke, it was still dark, the sky in the east glimmering with wan light. She was unbearably stiff and cold. Carefully she moved away from the others and sat up. Brocale lay on his back against the rocks, one hand on his axe, even in sleep. She could just see Carrie in the depths of his coat, but Thorkil was gone. She scrambled up, easing the pain from her back and arms. Then, quietly, so as not to wake the others, she pushed through the bushes and crouched down. The landscape was bleak and silent. Far off some bird was calling, a lonely cry over the miles of tundra. The wind was cold, but she knew it was milder than last night. Already the frost on the branches under her fingers was beginning to drip. But where was Thorkil? She was worried about him. The pain yesterday, which seemed to fade so quickly, that wasn't like him. She slipped out from the bushes and stood up. Below, over a shallow slope of scree, was the shore of the lake, its black reeds poking up from the frozen lid. Perhaps he was down there. She went down, the tiny stones trickling underfoot, and saw at the very edge that the ice was receding, thinning to a frill, where bubbles of trapped air slid and wheezed. She crouched down and drank. The water was bitterly cold and stagnant. Then a sound froze her. It was the slow clip-clop of hooves. It came from her left, somewhere nearby. As she looked round, she saw him, a horseman coming down the track, an armed man with ringmail that glittered in the pale light. She kept perfectly still. If she moved now, he would see her. The man drew rein. He looked across the dimness of the moor at the flat glimmer of the ice. Where were the rest of them, she wondered? Probably not far. His head turned. She held her breath, flattening against the wet stones, but he kept looking, beyond her. Then he urged the horse on. At the same moment she saw Thorkil. He was crouched behind a rock halfway up the slope. He hadn't seen her, but he was watching the rider intently. And then he did something that astonished her. He stood up and called. The rider's head turned swiftly. The horse whinnied with fright. As the horseman struggled with it, Jessa leapt to her feet, and Thorkil looked down at her. He stared as if she was a stranger. At the same time, the horseman dragged the horse's head to stillness. He looked up, and she saw him stiffen. He had seen her.